The Synchromystic presents Synchromystique. Neoplatonism is a philosophy emerging in the Greco-Roman world around the 3rd century of the Common Era that built on and modified various ideas that were first articulated by the towering 4th to 5th century BC Athenian thinker Plato. 20th century British philosopher Anthony Quinton once characterized Neoplatonism as a mystical rereading of Plato's ideas. This helpfully conveys the fact that Neoplatonism has one foot in the door of philosophy and rationalism, and the other in mysticism and even magic. In the words of William Lawhead, Neoplatonism is a religious Platonism. It's worth stating at the outset that Plato has had many followers of varying hues. In fact, British philosopher Alfred North Whitehead, whose own process philosophy has been identified as a contemporary reworking of Plato's ideas, once remarked, "The safest general characterization of the European philosophical tradition is that it consists of a series of footnotes to Plato." Because of this almost incalculable impact, Platonic ideas are liable to show up in a host of contexts. It is sometimes difficult to disentangle mystical Neoplatonism from other forms of Platonism more broadly construed. Not only this, but various authors use one word or the other, Platonism and Neoplatonism, to refer to either kind of philosophical tradition. In those cases, only a fuller examination of the details being considered will reveal which sort is under review. So what are some of the distinguishing features of Neoplatonism in the mystical sense? And who were some of the people associated with it? We'll look at both of these questions in order. I suggest that there are 5 characteristics you should focus on to get a sense of what makes up the core of Neoplatonism. These are, number 1, Neoplatonism's ontology, namely its view that the world consists of a hierarchy of entities with something called the One at the very top. Number 2, Neoplatonism's doctrine of emanation, that all lower realities emerge or trickle out of the One. Number 3, Neoplatonism's pantheism, its virtual identification of the divine with the entire universe. Number 4, Neoplatonism's related mysticism, or its conviction that human souls will not experience goodness or truth unless and until they reunite with the One. And 5, Neoplatonism's tendency toward syncretism, that is, its attempt to combine the religious and philosophical ideas of various systems. Let's go through each one of these in greater detail. Central to the Neoplatonic outlook is the concept of a hierarchical cosmos composed of various levels or spheres of reality. This has been called the Great Chain of Being. At the top of this complicated schema lies the mysterious One. The idea of the One comes directly from Plato's dialogue titled The Parmenides. It has become standard to associate it with Plato's form of the good, which is extensively described in what is perhaps his most famous writing, The Republic. Put in simplest terms, Plato's theory of forms basically held that the everyday physical world of our experience is merely the ever-changing and imperfect shadow of a perfect and unchanging realm of timeless ideas called the forms. Forms are the truest manifestation of reality. What we bump into in the physical world are mere approximations, echoes, and shadows of the forms. At the same time, particular objects, like dogs and trees and people, are the kinds of things that they are in virtue of their exemplification of, or participation in, one or more forms. Fido and Rover are both dogs because they both participate in a form that we may call dogness. The crabapple tree in my front yard and the dogwood in my backyard, despite their differences, are both trees because they exemplify the form of treeness. You and I both share humanness, and so on. A lot of problems and questions arise for proponents of this view. For example, are there subsidiary forms for crab apples and dogwoods? Are there forms for unsavory objects, such as excrement? Do the forms participate in themselves? These and many others are taken up by subsequent thinkers, including Plato's chief student, Aristotle. Indeed, Plato tackled many of these questions himself. We will ignore all of this and simply observe that, however many forms exist, if any exist at all, Plato seems to have ranked one form above the rest. This is his form of the good, symbolized by the sun. To the nearest approximation, then, these two Platonic ideas of oneness and goodness are brought together to yield the skeleton of the Neoplatonic one. If you add to this a species of reverence for the one, an attitude ostensibly imported from Oriental religion, then you have fleshed out some basic doctrines of textbook Neoplatonism. For the orthodox Neoplatonist, humans are incapable of saying much of anything meaningful about the one. It is essentially undefinable. This is because to define something is to distinguish it from everything else, to indicate what a thing is by separating it from what it is not. For example, triangles are closed, three-sided geometrical figures. But in defining triangles this way, we're simultaneously saying that triangles are not squares, they're not circles, and they're not straight lines. But the one is, or permeates, or underlies all reality. Somehow, the one contains all and is all. Therefore, there is nothing from which it can be separated. If a thing is definable, then it isn't the one. This caveat notwithstanding, Neoplatonists nevertheless held that the one, this ineffable, unknowable absolute, is at once the source of all being and the end, or telos, of human existence. The one is the source of reality because somehow out of the one, by an equally mystifying process termed emanation, flow the lower levels of being previously mentioned. These realms flow from the one something like light radiates from the sun, and they are commonly given a threefold description. Firstly, we have the realm of intelligence. This is often referred to as the province of something called nous, or mind. The concept goes back to the pre-Socratic thinker Anaxagoras, who thought of nous as the organizing principle of the cosmos. Other times, this level of intellect is referred to as the logos, which basically means reason. This term was imported from the enigmatic philosopher Heraclitus. It was funneled through Greek Stoicism where, similar to Anaxagoras' nous, it signified the orderly regulator of all reality. Eventually, the Logos informed Trinitarian Christianity by way of Middle and Neoplatonism, where it became associated with the second person of the Godhead, Jesus Christ, especially in his pre-existent form. But in Neoplatonism, its primary characteristic is its rationality. Because we can say this, we may also say that it is the first emanation of the one that is definable. Secondly, there is the realm of soul. In Greek, the word is psyche, which is more frequently transliterated with the letter Y and pronounced psyche. This realm is dominated by an entity known as the world soul. In Hermeticism and later systems, the world soul concept is sometimes designated by Latin phrases, such as anima mundi and spiritus mundi. For a sketch of Hermeticism, with particular emphasis on differentiating it from allied doctrines, such as those of Gnosticism and Neoplatonism, see the video 10 Arcane Words That Are Frequently Confused. Thirdly, we have the familiar and lowly physical world of matter, or hyle. This is the commonplace realm of day-to-day activity for most of us. We don't need to get bogged down on the particulars. The important things to note are, number one, the closer something is to the one, the better and more unified it is, and the further something is away from the one, the more divided and worse it is. And number two, the being or existence of each of these lower spheres, however deficient they may appear, is ultimately owed to and derived from the one. Because Neoplatonists tend to view the one religiously, as something akin to the way a more traditional theist would view God, the entire system is sometimes characterized as, or at least is compared to, an idea known as pantheism. The Greek word pan means all, and the root of theism, theos, means God. To put it in contemporary language, pantheism carries the sense that everything, for example, the entire universe considered all together, literally is the same thing as God. Everything is God. Though for the Neoplatonists, this has to be qualified somewhat, since the process of emanation introduces degradation or undesired plurality into the inexpressible simplicity of the One. Additionally, as previously stated, since the One is held to be indefinable, Neoplatonic theology, its doctrines about the divine, tends to be negative. Thinkers adopting this negative way, or via negativa, will speak only of what the One is not. The One is not limited. The One is immortal, indefinable, unknowable, and so on. This approach, also called apophatic theology, has carried over into Christianity, especially in the major branch known as Eastern Orthodoxy. But a moment ago, we also said that the One is the end or goal of human existence. And now we're in a better position to see why that is. For while our embodied human souls are languishing in the lowly world of apparent multiplicity, we will never truly experience the highest truth, namely the unified good, the One itself. This indisputably Platonic note, sounded by Neoplatonism, is merged with a Neo-Pythagorean emanationist scheme. For more on Pythagoras, see our dedicated video. Emanation flows two ways, so to speak. Not only do the various spheres of reality proceed out of the One, but everything, or at any rate some things, including some human souls, can in principle ascend the chain of being and return to the One. It is for this reason that Neoplatonism often appeals to people who have mystical inclinations, that is, people who seek a way of having a close experience with, or even of merging into, the divine. As such, this spiritualized philosophy thrived among some of the ancient adherents of mystery schools, like those relating to Dionysus and Orpheus, as well as the so-called Eleusinian mysteries, and later, Mithraism. Mention of these various ancient Greek religious systems leads us to the last point we'll consider here. Neoplatonism has a marked tendency towards syncretism. The prefix syn means to bring together, or to combine. For example, to synchronize watches requires setting them all at the same time. You're bringing all the watches together. Similarly, syntax refers to a language's rules about how to properly arrange words to form intelligible expressions. Syntax dictates how to combine words. In this case, to be syncretistic in your thinking is to draw together diverse and possibly seemingly unrelated or even contradictory ideas into a single unified system. In its Hellenistic historical context, Neoplatonism is something like a tapestry composed of pieces gleaned from philosophies that came before it. University of Pittsburgh classics professor Christian Wildberg writes that Neoplatonists achieved a grand synthesis of the varied traditions that they had inherited. In effect, they absorbed, appropriated, and creatively harmonized almost the entire Hellenic tradition of philosophy, religion, and even literature. The decisive influence of Plato has already been highlighted, but the Neoplatonists even incorporated much from Plato's student, Aristotle, who is often, and not without reason, understood as becoming his teacher's intellectual rival. Aristotle's impact is evident in the Neoplatonist concept of the intellect, as well as in Neoplatonism's adoption of Aristotelian logic. As hinted at earlier, the concept of emanation can be traced back to Pythagoras, via two seldom mentioned precursor movements usually referred to as Neo-Pythagoreanism, of which the reputed Hermetic sorcerer Apollonius of Tyana was a notable example, and Middle Platonism, represented by the philosopher-historian Plutarch. The fusing of these two streams in the thought of Numenius of Apamea prefigured Neoplatonism. The philosopher Plotinus is usually credited with being the originator of Neoplatonism. However, among those people who put Plotinus on his path was the shadowy Ammonius Saccas, about whom little is known. According to one persistent story, Ammonius Saccas was a sage from India. If true, this would suggest that Neoplatonism could have been a Graicized form of Hinduism. For more, look for our video, 10 Secret Adepts, or 10 Mystery Men. Be that as it may, Plotinus's lasting influence was guaranteed by his student, Porphyry, who transmitted his teacher's Neoplatonism in a book called the Enneads, which he edited. If Neoplatonism was founded by Plotinus, it was first codified by Porphyry. The subsequent communication of Neoplatonism is somewhat complex. For a bird's eye view, look for various charts, some of which I will post on the synchromystic.com, and others of which I will try to soon offer for sale on Amazon.com. However, the two post-Platonian figures usually singled out for special mention are Iamblichus and Proclus. Iamblichus is highly noteworthy because of his introduction of magic into the already mystically suffused philosophy of Neoplatonism. The Greek word is theurgy, which means literally work of God, but which has the sense of sorcery. One of the chief inspirations and sources of Iamblichus's magical Neoplatonism was an important ancient text known as the Chaldean Oracles. In the mid-4th century, Theon of Alexandria attempted to revive the non-magical original Neoplatonism of Plotinus. Theon's apparently short-lived school of mathematics and philosophy produced one of the most famous female intellectuals of the age, his ill-fated daughter, Hypatia, who is said to have been murdered by a mob. The reasons for this barbarous act are disputed. This reform movement notwithstanding, Iamblichus's magical Neoplatonism has seemed to have been a dominant stream ever since its inception, arguably reaching its fullest expression in Proclus. Shortly after Proclus's tenure leading the philosophical school in Athens, Neoplatonism fell out of favor, especially with emperors such as Justinian I, who had embraced Christianity. At this point, the era of ancient Neoplatonism basically closes, but the story of Neoplatonism is far from over. Neoplatonism lived on via offshoots. In fact, it can be helpfully thought of as launching along 3 or 4 distinct trajectories. One group picked up where Iamblichus left off. This variety of Neoplatonism was explicitly pagan. This is to be expected, since Porphyry and other early Neoplatonists were decidedly anti-Christian. These thinkers amplify Platonic themes such as reincarnation, a doctrine incompatible with the biblical account of the afterlife. For the Neoplatonist, human fulfillment lies in the exercise of autonomous reason or culminates in a mystical return to the One, rather than in cultivating a relationship with a personal creator God. Or again, as we saw with ancient Neoplatonism, for medievals, the One is often construed in the context of some form of pantheism. Since all reality is a series of emanations from the One, the Neoplatonist comes close to saying that everything is made of bits of the One, albeit in a degraded and rarefied way. On this view, matter proceeds ex deo, that is, quite literally, out of God's being, that is, out of the One. This process is presumably inevitable and necessary. It is somehow the nature of the One to emanate. By contrast, in Christianity, there is an ontological separation between God on the one hand and everything else on the other. Sometimes this is referred to as the creator-creation distinction. And it goes back to the ancient Hebrews, for whom the opening lines of the book of Genesis, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth," came to mean that matter was fashioned by God ex nihilo, that is, literally out of nothing. The most obvious representative of this later pagan Neoplatonism was the 4th century Roman emperor who was labeled Julian the Apostate by his Christian opposition. Some fundamentals of Christianity had been articulated at a gathering of church leaders held in Asia Minor in the city of Nicaea in the year 325 AD. After this version of Christianity gained traction under Constantine the Great, Emperor Julian led an opposition movement that attempted to resuscitate and reinstate Latin paganism. With Julian, the dynasty of Constantine came to an end. Julian's version of Neoplatonism leaned heavily on the magic-infused variety of Iamblichus. A second main variety of Neoplatonism was relevantly different. This Neoplatonism was Christian, to one degree or other. This may seem strange for a couple of reasons, not least of which was the previously mentioned antipathy of early Neoplatonists toward Christianity. For all the animosity, which was often a two-way street, some church fathers had a fondness for Plato himself. For example, the apologist Justin Martyr referred to Plato and Plato's teacher Socrates as Christians before Christ. Furthermore, during the early medieval period, Plato's works were largely unknown. The Timaeus was, however, an exception. It was concerned with the creation of the world by a demiurge, a lesser deity who formed the cosmos out of chaos using pre-existing materials. The demiurge loomed large in Gnosticism, on which see our past videos. Despite all this, we may discern two flavors or subtypes of Christian Neoplatonism. One sort is that which developed in tandem with the growing Catholic orthodoxy, at least as its dogmas successively codified at meetings called ecumenical councils that followed the initial successful Council of Nicaea. Some of the most important of these seminal gatherings included the Council of Constantinople in 381, the Council of Ephesus in 431, and ultimately the decisive Council of Chalcedon in 451. The initial stirrings of Catholic Neoplatonism go back to a group of scholars in Alexandria, Egypt, known as the Alexandrian School of Theology. It, with its penchant for an allegorical interpretation of Scripture, influenced such church fathers as Clement, Athanasius, and Cyril, all of whom are today recognized as saints in the Catholic Church. This Alexandrian Christian Neoplatonism was transplanted to the East, where it is evident in the theology of such people as Saints Basil, Gregory of Nyssa, and Gregory of Nazianzus, which three are collectively known as the Cappadocian Fathers. Without question, though, the most significant figure of the age to have been influenced by this stream of Neoplatonism was St. Augustine of Hippo. One of the towering doctors of the Western Church, Augustine looms so large during the Middle Ages that in many conservative-leaning contexts, Christian Neoplatonism is a virtual synonym for Augustinianism. Although he had been born in a Christian-believing home, Augustine abandoned this faith for almost a decade and lived a sexually promiscuous lifestyle. Additionally, he joined the Manichaeans, a group that owed its existence to the 3rd century Persian prophet Mani, as we mentioned in Top 10 Sex Magic Cults. However, in Milan, Italy, Augustine was introduced to a Catholic bishop and later saint named Ambrose. St. Ambrose exercised an enormous impact on his thinking. There are several relevant biographical factors. I will simply mention that it was at this time that Augustine became acquainted with the thought of the chief Neoplatonists, Plotinus and Porphyry. It could be said that Augustine crossed over a Neoplatonic bridge into Christianity from Manichaeism. Indeed, a Neoplatonic influence is evident in several of Augustine's doctrines. Number one, it arguably informed Augustine's belief that evil was a privation. In Gnostic Manichaeism, evil is a force opposed to the equal and opposite power of goodness. This opposition of good and evil is called dualism, as we noted in Gnosticism Explained in 5 minutes, and it shows up in several religions including Zoroastrianism, from which Manichaeism heavily borrowed. In contrast to this dualistic view, Augustine held that while good had a positive being, evil was simply a lack of good. To illustrate this, think of light and darkness. When you turn on the switch, the room fills with light. But when you turn the switch off, it's not like something else. Darkness comes streaming into the room and pushes out the light. Rather, it's simply that the light goes away. To say the room is dark is just to say that it has no light in it. Similarly, on Augustine's view, to say that something is evil is simply to say that whatever it is, whether it's an action or a person or whatever it is lacking good. But this view is reminiscent of the Neoplatonic hierarchy of being, in which every existing thing is derived from and owes its existence to the One. On such a view, there is only one principle of being, so to speak. All existing things are differentiated from one another in terms of the varying degrees to which they lack being. Towards the top of the chain are the Logos and the World Soul. Though not perfect, they enjoy a lot of being, since they are closest to the One. Towards the bottom, we find the world of matter. This verges on outright non-being, because it is as far from the One as it is possible to get. Number 2, Neoplatonism is arguably apparent in Augustine's epistemology. That is, his view of how humans acquire knowledge. According to Augustine's doctrine of illumination, we only achieve a state of knowing when and if God directly intervenes to enlighten our minds. In this, Augustine was influenced by the Neoplatonic notion that the eternal ideas or forms subsist in the mind of God, or, in Plotinus's vocabulary, they subsist in the Logos. You'll recall that for Plato, the forms are those invisible realities which make particular things what they are. For Plato, these forms just existed out there in what is sometimes half-jokingly called Platonic heaven. Remember, for Plato, humans undergo successive cycles of birth and death. In between, we exist in the spaceless, timeless realm of the eternal forms. Our knowledge of reality lying behind particular things arises when we remember these forms, on Plato's view. For Augustine, though, the forms are not in any Platonic heaven. They are in the mind of God. And for Augustine, humans do not reincarnate. As it says in the New Testament book of Hebrews, people are destined to die once, and after that, to face judgment. Therefore, to Augustine, our perception and knowledge of particular objects is dependent upon God. God shares the eternal ideas or forms with us, with the result that we acquire eternal and immutable truths about the objects. Without this divine illumination, knowledge would be impossible. Moreover, unlike thoroughgoing Neoplatonists, Augustine is committed to taking the Bible seriously, both as God's authoritative word to humanity and as a reliable history of the life of Jesus of Nazareth. Given this, Augustine distances himself from textbook Plotinian Neoplatonism in important ways. For instance, whereas Neoplatonists tended to be expositors of emanationism, pantheism, and, as we just said, reincarnation, Augustine was keen to stress the ontological separateness and creative activity of God, as well as a linear, rather than a cyclic view of cosmic and human history. These changes make a difference for mysticism and religious practice as well. Pagan Neoplatonists approach ascent to the One as a means of realizing a strict identity with it. To put it another way, the Neoplatonic mystic thinks of herself as trying literally to unite with the One. On the other hand, Augustinian mystics, such as Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, describe the mystical experience in terms of achieving, even if only temporarily, harmonious conformity between a believer's desire and will and God's perfect will. It is therefore unity of purpose rather than a strict ontological sameness. St. Anselm of Canterbury adopted an Augustinian outlook as well, and the influence of Augustinianism continued well into the scholastic period. The learned monk William of Champeaux was an Augustinian. William of Champeaux founded the school of St. Victor, where Orthodox mystics, known as the Victorines, would later thrive. Other figures, such as John of Salisbury, William of Auvergne, and Alexander of Hales, would extend Augustine's legacy further, though these thinkers frequently mixed Augustinianism with the philosophy of Aristotle. The development and interaction of Aristotelian and Platonic traditions is extraordinarily complex. An entire presentation could be devoted to the topic and still not plumb the depths, but we will make a few comments about it. First of all, the initial introduction of Aristotle into Neoplatonic thinking goes all the way back to Porphyry, who added Aristotelian elements to what he had inherited from Plotinus. This is particularly evident in his Isagogy, a commentary on Aristotle's work, The Categories. Apart from his logic, Aristotle's corpus was lost to the Latin West during the early medieval period. But, except for his politics, Aristotle was preserved in the Muslim world through this Western downturn. He was held in such esteem that he was simply called the philosopher, and he was reintroduced into Europe from Muslim thinkers such as Al-Kindi, Al-Farabi, and Averroes, as well as Jewish thinkers like Ibn Dawud and Maimonides. The wild card here was that Islamic philosophers misattributed a volume, which they knew under the title The Theology of Aristotle. This Arabic text, actually a conglomeration of the thought of Plotinus and Porphyry, led Islamic scholars to suppose that Aristotelianism contained elements of Neoplatonism. St. Thomas Aquinas had drawn from Maimonides and Averroes to achieve an original synthesis of Aristotelian philosophy and Christian theology. In part by modifying Aristotle, Aquinas created a Christian Aristotelianism, similar to how Augustine had forged a Christian Platonism. And Neoplatonism is contrasted to philosophies such as Thomism. Thomism gives primacy to being, whereas Neoplatonism gives primacy to becoming. Saint Bonaventure, Aquinas' contemporary, was wary of Aristotle. The so-called seraphic doctor, Bonaventure, advocated for a return to the Platonism of Augustine and an ensuing return to a spiritual union with God, even drawing upon the mystical theology of Dionysius, the pseudo-Areopagite. But mention of this latter Dionysian influence drives us headlong into the second flavor, or subsort, of Christian Neoplatonism. This one is a little harder to classify because, to some commentators, it is less obviously Christian in the traditional sense. It should be noted that flirtations with heterodoxy are by no means medieval novelties. For example, the Alexandrian school of Christianity, mentioned earlier, included Origen. Origen's orthodoxy is sometimes questioned, or flatly denied, partly on account of his endorsement of now condemned views, such as the pre-existence of the soul, and theological universalism. A popular Catholic apologetics website summarizes this latter view. Origen believed that, in the eschaton, that is, the end times, all people and all angels, even the fallen ones, would return to a pristine spiritual state. They will all end up in heaven. In the end, hell will be empty, and everybody will be saved. Occasionally, Alexandrian catechesis is connected to the views of people such as Apollinaris of Laodicea and Eutyches, both of whom are remembered for speculative doctrines about Jesus Christ that were declared to be heretical by the leaders of the ancient church. Two crucial characters in this heterodox Neoplatonic Christianity were the 6th century Roman philosopher Boethius and the anonymous person referred to as Pseudo-Dionysius. Boethius is mainly remembered for his Latin translations of Greek editions of select works from Plato and Aristotle, as well as his translation of Porphyry's introduction to Aristotle's categories. The upshot of these efforts was that the principal answers to the so-called problem of universals, a major focus of metaphysics in the Middle Ages, were framed largely by Boethius. The problem of universals arose when medieval thinkers contemplated the implications of Plato's theory of forms, which we sketched earlier. You will recall that these issues related to things such as, is there something that all dogs have in common with each other? To put it another way, when we identify both Fido and Rover as dogs, are we depending on and referencing some actually existing thing that both Fido and Rover share? Realists answer yes, and thereby commit themselves to the existence of natures, or universals, such as what we might call dogness, humanness, and so on. Or are we merely assigning the same word to Fido and Rover, from language conventions or from habit? People who take this line are known as nominalists, from the Latin word nomen, meaning name. Or is it something else? Apart from these questions, Boethius's major original work was The Consolation of Philosophy, which he wrote while in prison awaiting execution as a dialogue between himself and a personified spirit of philosophy or truth. Boethius is sometimes regarded as a Christian. Indeed, because he was put to death by the government, allegedly for treason, he is occasionally classified as a Catholic saint. That said, there is scholarly debate over his actual sympathies and over the appropriateness of viewing his death as true martyrdom. On the opposite extreme, some commentators view Boethius as a pagan Neoplatonist and a pantheist. Pseudo-Dionysius was a second notable figure in this ambiguous Neoplatonic stream. He later exerted a profound influence on the Franciscan religious order through the previously mentioned Bonaventure. The writings of this figure, whose true identity is unknown, won legions of followers in the church. For many years, it was believed that he was the historical Dionysius the Areopagite, who is depicted as converting to Christianity in the 17th chapter of a biblical book titled The Acts of the Apostles. It was mainly through Dionysius's influence that an esoteric Neoplatonism made significant inroads in Catholicism. Among pseudo-Dionysius's acolytes were the 9th century scholar John Scotus Erigena, figures associated with the 11th to 12th century school of Chartres, and the 13th century Dominican professor Albertus Magnus. Albert is best remembered as having been the teacher of St. Thomas Aquinas. We discussed Albert the Great in several videos, including Top 10 Gold-Making Alchemists and 10 Secret Adepts. But one of the most influential thinkers to proceed from the pseudo-Dionysian tradition was Aquinas' mystical contemporary and fellow Dominican friar, Meister Eckhart. Eckhart's first apologists, pupils, and fellow Dominicans, Henry Suso and Johannes Tauler, widely popularized a heavily mystical variety of Neoplatonism that once again verged on pantheism. This brand of mysticism drew heavily upon the via negativa. You will recall that we sketched this theology of negation earlier. It lent itself to a style of contemplation that was showcased and recommended in the anonymous 14th century tract titled The Cloud of Unknowing. Thus, a heavily Neoplatonic spiritualism became prevalent toward the end of the 13th century. It helped to undermine the scholastic rationalism that arguably reached its zenith in a version of Aristotelianism called Thomism, which was the philosophical religious legacy of Aquinas. The end of scholasticism and the rise of Reformation Protestantism, along with the Renaissance and modern philosophy, is bound up with the work of various Neoplatonic occultists, some of whom we will mention in a moment, and many of whom we have already surveyed in other videos, such as Top 10 Occultists of All Time and 10 Mystery Men. Here we'll note the 14th century Augustinian canon Jan van Ruysbroek, 15th century Carthusian monk Dennis Rickel, and German Renaissance humanist and mystic Nicholas of Cusa, also in the 15th century. This group's influence extends to the 20th century and beyond, where, for example, Meister Eckhart and Nicholas of Cusa would inform the psychiatry of German-Swiss thinker Karl Jaspers, and self-proclaimed spiritual guru Eckhart Tolle, whose real name is Ulrich Leonhard Terle, changed his name to Eckhart in an homage to the German spiritual leader Meister Eckhart. Before moving on to thinkers who would continue the above-named Neoplatonic traditions, we should say something, even if too briefly, about versions of Neoplatonism that were found in the two other so-called great monotheistic religions. Of course, the primary mystical traditions in Islam and Judaism are called Sufism and Kabbalism, respectively. Kabbalah, or Kabbalah, has already come up in past presentations such as 10 Arcane Words and Top 10 Sex Magic Cults. Even so, we hope to say much more about both streams in future videos. Suffice it here to say that until the Renaissance, the prominent version of Platonism within these two religious traditions was philosophical. This can be seen, for example, in the thinking of the 1st century Alexandrian Jewish Middle Platonist Philo Judaeus. It is also detectable in the works of the 9th century polymath Al-Kindi, called the father of Arab philosophy, and in the writings of the 12th century Spanish Jewish Halakhist and Talmudist Moses Maimonides. As was stated previously, the latter two were primarily Aristotelians, who incorporated Neoplatonic elements into their systems. Predictably, this blend is often called Neoplatonic Aristotelianism. The high watermark for Islamic Neoplatonism was arguably the work of Avicenna, otherwise known as Ibn Sina. In Judaism, one thinks of Avicenna. Philosophically, Neoplatonism provided answers to most major questions within the context of Islam, such as how multiplicity came from unity and how corporeality emanated from an incorporeal God, as well as explaining the ascending and descending order of beings. Having said this, elements of Neoplatonism show up elsewhere in both Islam and Judaism. For instance, consider that Al-Farabi's embrace of Neoplatonism paved the way for mysticism to enter Islamic philosophy. Neoplatonism strongly influenced the development of Sufism specifically. A major and seminal statement of this perspective, itself largely a reaction against the rationalism of Avicenna, was articulated by the towering 11th to 12th century figure al-Ghazali, who rejected philosophy altogether and became the exponent of Sufism alone. On a separate trajectory, there arose an Ismaili philosophy, which combined Sufi and Hermetico-Pythagorean ideas without rejecting Neoplatonism. This would bring the Ismailis into a close approach with what would become European Renaissance Neoplatonism. Within a Jewish context, we have the mystical treatise titled Sefer Yetzirah, or Book of Formation, usually dated to around the 4th century. It is a meditation upon the way God supposedly created the cosmos. In the system of the Sefer Yetzirah, as it was believed to have been revealed to the patriarch Abraham, God utilized the Hebrew language to create the universe. The unknown author, sometimes asserted to be the 1st to 2nd century rabbi Akiva ben Yosef, analyzed this alleged procedure into various esoteric letter manipulations. Some commentators have observed that the so-called Sephiroth, or attributes of God, are akin to Plato's forms, and the fact that the 22 letters of the alphabet have meaningful numerical correspondences sounds an unmistakably Pythagorean note. 19th century occultist Eliphas Levi would later associate the Hebrew letters with the 22 trump cards of the tarot. For a bit more on this and on Levi, see Top 10 Occultists, 10 Arcane Words, and 10 Secret Adepts. Or consider the probable 12th century text called the Sefer Bahir, or Book of Illumination. This work develops a Kabbalistic version of emanation, another concept characteristic of Neoplatonism. Concerning the monumentally important Sefer HaZohar, Book of Splendor, one rabbi writes that the appendix, known as the Hidden Midrash, seems to have its origins in Neoplatonism. Medieval Neoplatonism morphed into a different shape during the Renaissance. This is partially because streams that had been separated after the division and fall of the Roman Empire began once again to intermingle. For example, the distinct Eastern tradition of Neoplatonism that had been preserved in the Byzantine Empire by Greeks such as Michael Psellos and John Attalos were introduced into the West. Some key people in this transition were the Greek figures Pletho, also sometimes called Plethon, Manuel Chrysolaris, and Cardinal Bessarion. Following the fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Turks in the year 1453, and partially through the instrumentality of Pletho, Constantine Lascaris, and others, Neoplatonism's center of gravity shifted to Italy. There, in the so-called Florentine school, Marsilio Ficino and Pico della Mirandola were dominant. Like the Jewish and Islamic thinkers previously cataloged, Pico was not a thoroughgoing Neoplatonist. He was a syncretist who seems to have been chiefly motivated to try to combine elements from the various belief systems with which he was familiar, including Aristotelianism and Platonism. Pico's main claim to fame, as it were, rests on his introduction of Jewish mystical elements into Catholicism, creating the amalgam known as Christian Kabbalah. For the shadowy figures lurking behind both Pletho and Pico, see 10 Mystery Men. Elsewhere in Italy, the Venetians Francesco Giorgi and Franciscus Patricius, also called Patrizzi, communicated the Neoplatonic torch to England, Germany, and, within Italy itself, to Rome. Yes, Neoplatonism made its way to the Papal States, where it was promoted by Vatican insiders such as Italian literateur and Knight of Malta, Cardinal Pietro Bembo. Beyond the now familiar emanationism, key components of this Renaissance Neoplatonism were as follows. Number 1, the adoption by people like Ficino and Giorgi of a hierarchical view of the universe. Number 2, the theorizing of Hermetic correspondences that would underlie a plethora of ceremonial, mathematical, natural, and sympathetic types of magic. Although present in a subdued form even in Ficino, it would really become apparent in later figures such as Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa, whom we have spotlighted or mentioned in Top 10 Occultists, 10 Occultists who were accused spies, and 10 Mystery Men. And number 3, the renewal of attempts to synthesize a new religion by combining insights from all then-known religious systems. Sometimes described as an effort to resurrect an ancient religion, termed the Prisca Theologia, this synthesis rested on the conviction that all religions flowed from the same primeval source. It followed that they all, properly interpreted, articulated one cohesive theological perspective, alternatively labeled the perennial philosophy. This syncretism was typified by Pico, who sought to harmonize Neoplatonic Christianity with the philosophies of Aristotle and Plato, as well as with astrology, Hermeticism, and the Kabbalah. On the latter, we note that Spanish Kabbalistic mysticism had only then been introduced into Italy by way of rabbis escaping the Jewish expulsion order issued in 1492 by King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. For more background on that episode, including some behind-the-scenes operators, see 10 Mystery Men. After this point, there seems to be yet another split. Before spelling out these two branches, let me say something prefatory about humanism in general, and the circle of English Catholic saint and martyr, Sir Thomas More, specifically. You will recall that, along with Desiderius Erasmus and John Colet, Thomas More is routinely classed as one of the Oxford Reformers, a group of humanist scholars loosely associated with Oxford University in England. Although they preceded, and in More's case especially, resisted the Protestant Reformation, technically so called, they are thought of as reformers in the sense that they championed approaches to Bible interpretation and other matters that marked a departure from medieval thought. These men furthered an overall renewal of interest in the art, literature, and philosophy of the Greco-Roman world. This movement, called Renaissance humanism, went back to the 14th century writer known as Petrarch, who attempted to recover ancient manuscripts that had been lost during the medieval period that he referred to as the Dark Ages. As briefly mentioned in 10 Mystery Men, John Colet was for a time in close contact with the previously mentioned intriguer Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa. Again, for the lowdown on Agrippa, see our library of past videos. Besides advancing humanism, Thomas More helped introduce the British Isles to the thought of seminal Christian Kabbalist Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, whom we just mentioned. But the spirit of the Renaissance also sparked interest in a group of writings called the Hermetica. And this is where we pick up a line of Neoplatonism comprised of a string of men who were predominantly academics. Chief among these are the men known as the Cambridge Platonists, including Henry More, a descendant of the previously mentioned Sir Thomas More. According to historian Francis Yates, one distinguishing feature of Cambridge Platonism was that these new professorial Neoplatonists distanced themselves from Hermeticism. First and foremost, Hermeticism was a cluster of stories, collectively termed the Corpus Hermeticum. According to legend, a figure named Hermes Trismegistus, or Thrice Great Hermes, had mastered the 3 parts of wisdom, a trio of occult sciences consisting of alchemy, astrology, and magic. For more on this, see 10 Arcane Words and 10 Gold-Making Alchemists. Hermetic lore held that Hermes was a primordial figure. The character was frequently identified with various mythical deities, among them the Egyptian god Thoth. In numerous books offered for sale on Amazon.com, not to mention in articles on scores of websites of varying reliability, one can still read claims such as that, according to legendary Egyptian priest Manetho, Hermes wrote 36,000 books, or that he dates to some astounding past time, such as 36,000 BC. For more on the possible significance of the number 36 and its multiples, stay tuned for a future video on some aspects of numerology, which we have planned. A variation on this theme concerns the so-called Emerald Tablet. This is a short text, just a collection of a dozen or so sentences really, but it is believed to set forth what is often taken to be the essence of the Hermetic outlook, the alchemical maxim, as above, so below. This tantalizing and cryptic phrase is typically explained in terms of an elaborate theory of correspondences. This is the doctrine that various associations or connections, whether symbolic or otherwise, exist among the levels of reality. For example, between the celestial realm of the stars and the commonplace world of human society, or even with the parts of our own bodies and souls. Because this Hermetic dictum asserts, or assumes, the existence of a hierarchical universe, it can be fitted quite nicely into an overarching Neoplatonic worldview. And for a long time, this is what was done. The antiquity of Hermes was believed even by the highly educated. The previously mentioned Ficino, for example, expended considerable effort translating several Hermetic books at the behest of his patron, Cosimo de' Medici. Ficino even temporarily sidelined a massive project of translating the works of Plato in order to tackle the Hermetica. He did this because both he and Cosimo believed that Hermes was an even more ancient and more important authority than Plato. Ficino's translations of the Hermetica were expanded upon by the purported magician and Neoplatonist Lodovico Lazzarelli. Giordano Bruno was perhaps the last notable figure of the period to have been Hermetic in the original sense of seeming to take the story of Hermes literally. Incidentally, Bruno's associations may have brought him into the orbit of Queen Elizabeth I's royal astrologer, the sorcerer John Dee, whom we highlighted in our Top 10 Occultists video. In any event, Bruno has the dubious distinction of being one of the last people burned at the stake for heresy, by order of the Roman Inquisition. A tangent academic line may also be detected through Bruno's influence. For example, in 1714, the famous continental rationalist German philosopher Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz set forth a metaphysical theory centering upon the curious notion of a monad, which term had been coined by Bruno in 1591, though Bruno had himself adapted it from past concepts such as John Dee's Monus Hieroglyphica. In the year 1614, about a decade and a half after Bruno's execution, a Swiss-born philologist named Isaac Casaubon published a book challenging the Hermes mythology. He argued that the Corpus Hermeticum was unlikely to have had the kind of provenance that would have placed its author approximately in the late Stone Age. Rather, according to his analysis, both of the language and the style of the texts, Casaubon estimated the probable date of composition somewhere between the 1st and 4th centuries AD. In other words, it had emerged from Latin Hellenism, or shortly thereafter. While even this time is early by conventional historical measures, Casaubon's thesis does tend to deflate the pretension that Hermetic doctrines harken back to the misty expanses of human prehistory. In other words, Casaubon believed that the much-revered Hermetic stories were at best a kind of folklore. Perhaps they were concocted in an attempt to popularize and make more relatable some of the intricate philosophies, like ancient Neoplatonism, that grew up in the intellectually tumultuous Greco-Roman period, and that would not have appealed to people who weren't looking to major in philosophy. Those academics that accepted Casaubon's much later date of the Corpus Hermeticum, including, in Yeats's opinion, most of the Cambridge Platonists, didn't have much reason to esteem Hermes. As a result, many Neoplatonists, and most scholars generally, have eschewed Hermeticism from then on. But there is a second line of broadly allied thinking that can be traced back at least to a 16th to 17th century German shoemaker named Jakob Boehme. According to the late historian Nicholas Goodrick Clark, Boehme was steeped in the thought of the Swiss alchemist and experimental physician who was born Theophrastus von Hohenheim, but is probably better known as Paracelsus. We covered Paracelsus in greater detail in Top 10 Gold-Making Alchemists, and we sketched the history of Paracelsus's mysterious mentor, Johannes Trithemius, in 10 Mystery Men. Some commentators suggest that there is a species, or at least an analog, of Neoplatonism to be found in Paracelsus and Boehme. For example, Antoine Favre compared Paracelsus to the Neoplatonists Plotinus and Porphyry, writing that they shared a qualitative concept of time, which flows in 1,000 ways, with each individual thing possessing its own rhythm. His thought is highly idiosyncratic, but at the very least, Boehme is Neoplatonic in the sense that he follows generally in the Plotinian tradition by practicing meditative and mystical methods that promise to permit gaining access to a super-sensible reality. The ideas of Paracelsus and Boehme arose in non-academic Protestant Lutheran contexts. This is certainly not to say that Orthodox Lutherans approved, but once Martin Luther himself had challenged and then rejected the authority of the Catholic Church, a precedent of rebellion was established, and no Lutheran orthodoxy could fare better than the long-standing system it had been intended to replace. But these folks also existed, at least partially, outside of the official university system. This was typical of thinkers in the period. Machiavelli, for instance, was a statesman. Francis Bacon was a lawyer and a statesman. Descartes studied law and became a mathematician and proto-scientist. Baruch Spinoza was a lens grinder. Leibniz was a librarian. John Locke was a physician and political advisor. And David Hume wrote works of history, and so on. It is therefore noteworthy that Paracelsus was primarily educated by his father, and from books such as those written by by the mysterious Benedictine monk and purported magician, Johannes Trithemius, mentioned moments ago. As stated, we treated Trithemius in much greater depth in 10 Mystery Men. Similarly, becoming a cobbler didn't require a formal education. Like Paracelsus, Berma's intellectual formation occurred largely outside of the control of the university system or of organized religion. Instead, while he apprenticed in his trade, he filled odd hours reading the Bible and interacting with Paracelsian physicians. Still, the blueprint for Paracelsian and Bermian cosmologies is sufficiently similar to what we have been considering to prompt Nicholas Goodrick Clark to remark that it is reminiscent of the emanationist Neoplatonic philosophy of Plotinus. And we would expect this, given that one can basically draw a line from the thinking of Plato and Plotinus through Marsilio Ficino and Pico della Mirandola to Johannes Trithemius, who, as we just heard, exerted a tremendous formative influence upon Paracelsus. Paracelsus himself is then picked up by Belgian alchemist Gerhard Dorn, who would later influence pioneering Swedish depth psychologist and psychoanalyst Carl Gustav Jung. Paracelsus's thought informs that of the German theologian Valentine Weigel. For more on that potent name, which also shows up in Rosicrucian history, see Be My Valentine. Paracelsus also shaped German Hermeticist Heinrich Kunrath, whose Amphitheatrum Sapientiae Aeternae functions as a bridge from alchemy to Rosicrucianism in Germany, as well as to the occult tradition in England. That latter English tradition includes preeminently Queen Elizabeth I's royal astrologer and reputed sorcerer, John Dee. But Kunrath may also, in the words of Professor Favre, have set Berma on his path. Paracelsus's elemental speculations would be furthered by German alchemist Oswald Kroll and Belgian chemist Jan Baptiste van Helmont, whom we reference in Top 10 Gold-Making Alchemists. Berma would exert a tremendous influence on the direction of the so-called Radical Reformation, a point which we hope to develop in a forthcoming video. Otherwise, Bemanism, as this folk variety of Neoplatonism was called in England, also seems to have set the stage for the major 17th century esoteric cultural phenomenon known as Rosicrucianism. Rosicrucianism, in turn, would inspire Englishmen, such as the antiquarian Elias Ashmole, who came in at the ground floor of what would, in the 18th century, be recognized as speculative Freemasonry. Both Rosicrucianism and Freemasonry, in both its 3-degree craft variety and in various appendant high-grade esoteric systems, are such large topics that I cannot do them justice here. Instead, I intend to create follow-up presentations treating these and other topics with greater care. For the time being, I'll simply note that even if his name is less familiar today, Berma's influence has by no means completely waned. The popular spiritual writer Eckhart Tolle, mentioned moments ago, credits the idiosyncratic artist Bo Yin Ra with inspiring his path. Would you be surprised to learn that Bo Yin Ra, a 19th century painter whose real name was Joseph Anton Schneiderfranken, was partly inspired by, guess who? Jakob Berma. According to some observers, Tolle's worldview is the contemporary embodiment of the sort of syncretism that has occupied us throughout this study, and which he arguably inherited from his immediate Theosophical and New Age predecessors. I'm thinking here of people like H.P. Blavatsky and Alice Bailey, G.I. Gurdjieff and his disciple P.D. Uspensky, and more recently, Marilyn Ferguson and other popularizers of the New Age, such as Shirley MacLaine. To say that Plato's influence on Western culture and thinking has been enormous would be an understatement of gigantic proportions. His philosophy, both as Plato articulated it and as it would be developed by the Neoplatonists, beginning with Plotinus and Porphyry, has profoundly shaped many worldviews. Serious observers, both of the occult specifically and of the history of thought generally, will find that it is worth familiarizing themselves with the basic contours of the Platonic and Neoplatonic traditions. Literature students also will be served by a working knowledge of Neoplatonism. For example, consider the Florentine poet Dante Alighieri, whose monumental Divine Comedy was made a leitmotif in Dan Brown's Inferno and Ron Howard's 2016 film adaptation. For although Aquinas and Augustine are Dante's immediate philosophical ancestors, it is also clear that his epic poem fuses themes from Plato, Neoplatonism, and the Islamic tradition, especially that of Avicenna. And as we have seen, Neoplatonism is relevant to gaining a full understanding of key Renaissance personalities, such as Plato and Marsilio Ficino, who resuscitated it and blended it with humanism. From Italy, it spread all over Europe. The Italian diplomat and writer Baldassare Castiglione wrote about Platonic love in his instruction manual, The Book of the Courtier. Castiglione, whether directly or indirectly via the English translation of Sir Thomas Hoby, along with Bainbo and Ficino, seems to have shaped the Shakespearean corpus. Besides the Bard, Platonic elements also figure in the works of English poets Edmund Spenser, John Donne, and many others. But Neoplatonism is also detectable in the 17th century institutional university settings, for instance, in the activity of the previously mentioned Cambridge Platonists. It crops up again during the 18th and early 19th centuries in the Romantic movement, for example with English poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge and translator Thomas Taylor. William Blake is yet another mentionable in whose work Neoplatonism is given artistic expression, for example in Blake's illustrations for an edition of Dante's Divine Comedy. On Blake's more sex-magical interests and the broader context, see our previous video on that topic. According to academic Arthur Verschluis, the traditions of Indian religion and Neoplatonism coalesced in 19th century Transcendentalism, an American version of Romanticism famously associated with writers Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau. According to author Kathy Gutierrez, 19th century American spiritualism, connected to reputed healers and mediums such as Andrew Jackson Davis, the Fox Sisters, and Cora Hatch, may be understood as a cultural expression of Neoplatonic Renaissance thinking refurbished for American use. Some critics find the impress of Plotinus in the works of British poet William Butler Yeats, best known in occult circles for his association with the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. Of course, there's popular fantasy writer C.S. Lewis, who wrote the Chronicles of Narnia, several installments of which were recently made into movies. Lewis also penned numerous non-fiction works defending belief in Christianity, to which he was warmed up by his friends and fellow novelists and professors Hugo Dyson and J.R.R. Tolkien. The latter, of course, is best known for his fantasy novels, including The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. Tolkien had converted to Catholicism in 1900, but James Webb characterized Lewis's spiritual views as, quote, a Neoplatonic form of Christianity, end quote. As a synchro-mystical aside, we cannot help mentioning that C.S. Lewis, along with Aldous Huxley, author of dystopian classic Brave New World, just happened to die on the same day that U.S. President John Fitzgerald Kennedy was assassinated. We have so far tackled that fateful day in a single video, to which we may add more later. Wrapping up the present topic, Neoplatonism may have been a precursor to the process philosophy of Alfred North Whitehead and Charles Hartshorne, as well as to the spin-off process theology movement associated with people such as John Boswell Cobb and David Ray Griffin. Process thinking picks up on the Neoplatonic emphasis on becoming. Even the most basic tenet of Platonism, insistence upon the metaphysical reality of forms, persists in some currents of Western philosophy today. You'll find it, for instance, in German logician Gottlob Frege's notion of a third realm, beyond the realms of the physical world and our mental states, and in British ethicist G.E. Moore's non-natural properties, which he offered as his ground for moral truths. In fact, this Platonic element arguably shows up in any thinker, in at least a low-grade form, who endorses an idea of really existent abstract objects as distinct from concrete objects in space and time. This broad category would include such people as Kurt Gödel, Bertrand Russell, and Willard Van Orman Quine. Numerous other contemporary scholars, Diogenes Allen, Simon Blackburn, Miles Bernier, Richard Kraut, Melissa Lane, S. Sarah Monison, Alexander Nehamas, Leo Strauss, A.E. Taylor, and Gregory Vlastos being notable examples, have found the careful study of Plato to be worthwhile, even if, as was the case with Karl Popper, they take a critical posture towards him. And of course, Platonism, in one variety or other, has resonated with religious believers of many persuasions who frequently find that it coincides with, or even expresses, doctrines that posit otherworldly entities such as angels and God, and hidden realms such as heaven and hell. If there's an interest, I may attempt a shorter version of this study, something along the lines of Gnosticism explained in 5 minutes. Let me know your opinion in the comments below. But if you found something of interest in this video, please like it, and if you think someone else would appreciate it, please share the link. Thanks for watching.